All right, there we go. So today we're going to be talking about perfect time. Today we're going to be talking about journalism. This was suggested by one of you. Um, if you are interested more in journalism, please let me know. This is as much as I could find, but obviously I may not do everything. I actually did work in journalism briefly for a time. Very briefly. I wrote like 4 articles. Crazy and I quit. But um, journalism can be very rewarding and a lot of fun. I mostly worked on what they might call fluff or puff pieces, um, where I would go to theater showing at UVU or things like that because it was for the university. I'd go to a theatrical performance of some sort or a concert, and then I would write about this is what they sang, and they sang it so beautifully. It was amazing, those kinds of things. How journalism is, if you prefer puff pieces, though, by all means, go for that. It can also, and it can also be very ultimately moving if you decide to go that direction. There are lots of people who work in other countries to talk about like here's what's actually happening on the actual ground floor of this war, or in this specific country, or sometimes there are some journalists who even risk their lives to uncover stuff like that and are like, hey, guess what? There's a drug trade happening right in this state that you have no idea because they've been covering it up. They try to uncover it, and sometimes they die. So it can get really intense if you want to go that intense, but that's up to you. You could also just write about this celebrity and this celebrity got married. Yay. So journalism has a lot of um, moving beyond what journalism is, though. Journalism, in some ways, is more than just reporting because it is reporting it in a way that people will actually listen to. Reporting it in a way that people actually pay attention to. This is where your creative writing skills come into play because you aren't just saying so and so and so and so got married. That's boring. You say like they got these types of flowers and there was a little bit of drama because the bridesmaids got in a fight or whatever. Makes it more interesting for other people to read because they are seeing it at a closer look, getting to see what you want to show them. That's why a lot of people theorize that journalism is slightly biased, but it depends on how you write it. You can write it in an interesting way that is not biased. People just tend to write it in an interesting way that is biased. um, Try to keep your biases in mind, though. I would say most places want you either biased in their direction or they want you not biased. um, Mainly the things that I noticed when I was doing more in depth on journalism is the first thing you need is good research. Now, what does research skills mean? That can mean a lot of different things. That can mean interpreting data. That can mean looking at a bunch of different other articles that people have done on this topic and then saying, okay, I'm noticing a pattern here. What is the trend here? Let's see if we can put all this information together and kind of prove a certain point or show a certain dynamic or something like that. So research skills are incredibly important. Hello. If you're going into journalism. With your research, you always want to make sure that you do the most you can to look at both sides. As I said, being non-biased is typically a good thing. Every once in a while, you'll have a journal that's like, but we only want to toe this specific line. Well, that's great if they want to do that. But most journals will request that your research be double-sided. That you're like, okay, if I'm going to do research on this specific crazy thing that's going on, I'm going to talk to the people who are on this side of the war and on this side of the war. I'm not just going to talk to this side. I'm going to talk to both sides and see what they think about it. Are these guys attacking them in are they attacking them and thinking, hey, we're in the right here? And if they both think they're in the right, then is one of them wrong because of a misunderstanding? You try to look instead of saying, cool, he says he did it. Great. That's not great journalism skills. Keeping in mind with research, the next thing that a lot of journalists recommended having good skills in is simply basic curiosity. because being curious is what helps you to find the truth, is what helps you to find the answers that everyone else is seeking. Because you're saying, hey, instead of just Timmy says that Billy did it, great, Billy did it, you're saying, okay, Timmy says that Billy did it, but what does Billy say happened? You have more questions, you dig deeper, you look more introspectively instead of just taking things at face value. Look deeper and think more. One thing that I will say can be taken too far is this is when you start getting into the conspiracy theories, you know? You make sure that it is based in solid, sound research, whatever you're doing. Curiosity is good, but if you start being like aliens and you have no proof that it's aliens, that could be a problem. um, next thing is this is something that a journalist mentioned that I really appreciated. Um, this is an amalgamation of research that I've done. And he mentioned that journalism is a really tough job. So if you're going into journalism because you're like, oh, I just don't want to query my novel, it sounds like it'll be too much work, and I'll get rejected so many times. This specific journalist mentioned, yeah, he's had thousands of his papers rejected and gotten fired and all this stuff. So unfortunately, it's equally difficult. So don't go into journalism thinking I'm going to be rich and it's going to be amazing and super easy. Because it's not, unfortunately. Any career in creative writing is not going to be easy because everyone thinks they know what good writing looks like, and unfortunately, you may not fit their bias. And that kind of sucks, right? But that doesn't mean you can't make it. It just means it's going to be tough, and you need to realize it's going to be tough. The other thing, it wasn't honestly a great paycheck. You do it because you love it, not because you think it like make you famous and live in a lovely lavish house. No, he was like, honestly, most of us are middle class. Most of us maybe get a piece on the front page every once in a while, but most of the time, even the most famous journalists are just doing okay. um, however, moving forward with that aspect, um, never lose your drive. That was something that they mentioned. Whatever drives you to be a journalist, if you choose to be a journalist, never lose sight of that. Whether it's, hey, I wanted to make people laugh, and so you do a bunch of articles about goofy, funny things that happen. Or, hey, I want to make people realize that politics or whatever, then you don't lose that. You continue to let that drive you instead of letting money drive you or fame or fortune. Make sure that it's what you want to see in the world, what you want to tell the world. Tell your story. That's really what this is about. So don't lose that drive, whatever that drive is, whatever it is that is making you want to be a journalist, don't lose that. Make sure you hold on to that. Continue, especially, I would say this is a great one for novelists too, because don't lose what that drive is. You may have been rejected by, but don't lose that drive. Whatever that drive is. For me, it's enjoyment of writing. For me, it's being able to put words on the page and create these dynamic characters. For you, it might be you love fairy tales or you love creating diverse characters. Don't listen to people are saying, I'm not going to publish it. Just keep trying, keep going. All right, next. All right, next thing that was recommended was finding meaning in every story. Because even if you are one of those journalists that goes into a war torn country and tells everyone about the corruption there and what's going on, or talks to all these refugees or something like that, never lose them, never lose that meaning of each story because you might not have a big story every time. You might have a tiny little puff piece about the local theater doing really, really well this year. You might not always get those big, intense stories. And so, as a result, realize that all of them have meaning. What does this theater story have meaning for the community? I know for me, when I was writing puff pieces for the university journal, what helped meaning was the fact that I loved art and I loved seeing art and I loved seeing people enjoy art. And so that's what gave it meaning to me because I was able to show other people in art, even if they missed out on the art, I was able to say, hey, these dancers did a gorgeous job and they represented this. And had metaphorical tangs of this and all these different things. And it made it so that I felt I could repaint the picture for those who had missed out, and they could still get to be a part of it. So finding the meaning in each piece that you're working on with journalism can be really helpful. You'll probably start out doing puff pieces. Most people do. You probably won't end up being the intense journalist until about halfway through your career. um, Next thing is interview skills. Make sure that you learn how to interview someone well. Now, part of the reason this is important is because whether you're doing a puff piece or some sort of really intense drug trade or something, getting information through people can be one of your greatest resources. There's a lot of times where, especially with political corruption or even with a little puff piece, you might have trouble getting information just basic. You might be like, okay, I'm curious to know what the numbers are for this statistic. And they're like, sorry, those are confidential files. And you're like, okay, then why don't we just talk over coffee, discuss a little, and you might get some information that way about what the numbers look like even without getting the data itself. And sure, would that be good to get the data itself? Absolutely. But if you can't, the next best thing is to interview someone, right? Who knows that and who knows what's going on. So good interview skills and good people skills can be a great way to gain that information. I'm not going to go into that as much because that's a whole lesson by itself. So I would say just go to YouTube, Google interview skills and people skills, and study a lot of those because those can be really helpful. There's even a book called How to Win Friends and Influence People. That would be a fantastic book to read if you plan to be a journalist, because making friends is part of being a journalist. You talk to the wife of this celebrity and then you get really good friends with her, and then she's like, I'm gonna invite you to tea, and you're like, sweet, I get to meet this celebrity and write my puff piece. It really helps to be able to know how to win friends and influence people. And I know some people think that might be manipulative, but it's not necessarily manipulative. You're just learning how to be someone that other people like to have around, and therefore you're going to gain more information just by making friends, genuinely making friends. All right. Next thing, developing critical thinking skills. So, critical thinking skills, once again, kind of goes with curiosity, because it's important that you don't just take things at face value, as I mentioned before. It's also important with critical thinking skills to realize that more going on here. Even if you have a puff piece and someone's just like, hey, write about this celebrity's wedding, you might look at deeper and go, wow, this is a really complicated relationship. Or you might learn something crazy like, oh my gosh, they're getting married because she's pregnant or something. Gasp, whatever. But use your critical thinking skills to think outside of the box, to look from the story from a different angle. Don't just say, okay, this is the story. Make sure you're like, okay, there might be a more creative way to look at this. There might be a more interesting way to view this story. All right. So, now we're going to talk a little bit about the writing itself. There are lots of different journalism techniques. I found probably 5 while I was just doing some research. One of them is better than the other, not necessarily. You got to find kind of what works for you. 2 things, though, that people said, no matter what journalism technique you use, are important to remember, is that captivating writing skills doesn't necessarily mean fancy writing skills. You don't have to be like 7 years ago for people to listen to you. You can also just say, hey, I'm going to tell this story backwards. So I'm going to, kind of almost clickbait them and say, oh my gosh, there's this really dramatic thing that you'll never guess. And then they have to wait till the end to read it. Or you can do the reverse and be like, I'm going to start with the really exciting thing, and then I'm going to tell the story backwards and say, whoa, I'm going to skip to 2 weeks earlier and explain how we got here, or something like that. Or if it's a political thing, talk about, hey, this is how it's going to affect you and your life, which makes the reader much more engaged, right? And so having eloquent wording or writing in a way to impress your fellow journalists, write in a way that is going to speak to the people and your people. And when I say your people, I mean whoever your audience is. So if you are like me in the journalism position that I was in for UVU, if you were just writing puff pieces, I wrote for my audience of artists. I wrote for my audience of people who love art and want to be a part of art in fluffy language. But that was because I knew artists would appreciate that and see the deeper meaning in that. But if I was writing a piece on like, hey, they did a really great job with this job fair and there were all these dozens of jobs here and here's all the cool jobs that you missed out on and come to our next one kind of thing, then I would have written it entirely differently. I'd probably use a lot less flowery language. I probably would have been more like interview stuff. I probably would have quoted a lot more people. So depending on what you're writing too can also change how you write the piece. It's kind of like with novels. I'm tired. A novel that is for junior fiction, for younger kids, for about 12 to 14, is going to be something that is going to be a lot for that age group. You're going to have probably less big, huge, giant words. You're probably going to have things that are a lot more goofy, a lot more silly, a lot more fun. Whereas even just moving from YA, you'll notice a difference, right? When you read a young adult book versus a junior fiction book, they have a distinctly different tone, even just in the level of how dark they get. You'll read the first Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, much less dark than Harry Potter #7, Deathly Hallows, right? That's why it's in both sections. Because junior fiction and young adult read very differently, and that's because they're for different audiences. All right. Next thing we're going to talk about is data/data, however you want to pronounce it. This was one thing that a lot of journalists mentioned, and that was learning how to read data, because data can lie to you. Or people can say, this is what the data says, and that's not actually what the data says when you actually read it. And so it's incredibly important that you get some sort of data analysis experience, because most journalists actually don't have data analysis experience. Yes?
Yeah, as a current statistics student, I
Yeah.
hear that a lot. They can twist the data around, or they can find
Absolutely.
evidence for one thing when actually that's not true at all.
Yes, exactly. And so a lot of journalists actually don't have any data analysis experience. They just take it on face value and then they look silly. Or alternatively, they have to hire a data analysis to do the work for them. Whereas if you know data analysis, you can do that yourself. And you will look much more appealing to an employer as well for journalism. So that, great point. So I would say learn how to read data really well. That will make you much more appealing to an employer if you decide to go into journalism. All right. Next thing is university or not to go. University. To go or not to go? That is the question. That is forever asked by creative writing students of everyone. Doesn't matter whether you're going into journalism or whether you're going into academia or whether you're going into novel writing or short story writing. This is always the question. Now, if you're doing more academia, I would say university is definitely probably a must because you'll look much more academic if you have degrees and fanciness. Whereas if you're a novel writer or a journalist, a lot of people say they learn in journalism school and they learn in creative writing school, sure. However, a lot of journalists said that they learned just as much, if not more, from being out in the field and actually doing journalism than they did in a school for journalism. And I would say the same thing about creative writing. I've actually learned more about novel writing just reading other people's books about writing and going to classes about writing than I ever did going to my creative writing degree. I appreciate my creative writing degree. It's nice to have a creative writing bachelor's, but honestly, did I really need to do that? Not necessarily if I was just writing a book. Because I'm an editor, yeah, I kind of need that. But if I wasn't doing the editing track and I was just writing a novel, you don't necessarily need that. Now, am I saying don't go to school? Absolutely not. One thing that they mentioned in journalism that I will mention is important for creative writing too is sometimes getting a degree in something else can be equally helpful. For example, with journalism, they mentioned that
you should get a degree in whatever's most adjacent and most important to the field you want to work in. So, for example, if you want to work in reporting crime, you should probably get a criminal justice degree. If you want to work in climate change reports, you should probably get a degree in earth science. And that way you have more entrenched knowledge in that field. And then when you go to get hired by a journalism company, you can also say, this is my specialty, this is my niche, and they will take you more seriously. And so as a result, you don't necessarily need a journalism degree. You just need to pick what you are going to write and dive into that. And same thing I would say with creative writing. If you're going to write about mythology, get a degree in mythology. If you're going to write about historical fiction, get a degree in history. Find something that is near enough so you can find something you enjoy and find another job you enjoy while you're querying and stuff. And also learn something from it at the same time. Get some benefit out of it. Nothing wrong with getting a creative writing or journalism degree, but it can be equally important and, if in some ways more valuable, to get a degree in whatever you want to work in. All right, let's keep going. Okay, two things that I just want to mention briefly, because they were mentioned by several people as well. Don't worry about being the biggest, most journalism company around. Don't be like, if I don't work for New York Times, I can't be a journalist. Like, no. This specific journalist said that they actually have seen more success at their smaller company than they have at the larger companies that they've worked at, because they're in some ways more willing to give them feedback. They're more willing to talk to them. They're more willing to work with them because they don't have 1,000 other journalists that they're working with. It's mostly just you. And so as a result, they're able to give you more time and attention. And so in some ways, working for a smaller company and then maybe working your way up the ladder would be good. Next thing that they also mentioned was that you may write the best journalism article in all of existence, and your quality of work may be insanely good, just amazing. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll be famous. One of the things they mentioned, journalists, and one of the journalists they felt like made a huge impact on society and has won awards and all these things, actually only has like 600 Instagram followers. They're not exactly what you'd call famous, but in the journalism world, they made an impact. They made a punch. Everyone read their articles, just no one knows their name. It's kind of like, it would be kind of like similar to if Harry Potter, we didn't know who wrote it, or Percy Jackson, if we didn't know who wrote it. It's like, we all know the name, but who wrote it? And that can happen sometimes with journalism, because people get so caught up in what the news was that they forget who wrote it. So you might kind of blend into the background, kind of disappear. But if you like the Invisible Man / Woman act, maybe that's for you. You can kapoof. All right. Just like any other writing, make sure that you know how to take some criticism, because there are a lot of times when you might receive a lot of criticism, but also know when they're wrong. And yes, editors and publishers can't be wrong. I will even say I've done that sometimes, where I've edited something and then someone said, that's not right. And I was like, it looks like it's right. And they're like, it's wrong because of XYZ. And I'm like, I didn't even know that's what you were trying to say in the sentence. Okay, yeah, that is wrong. Let's try something else. Because sometimes they misidentify what you're saying or misidentify what your purpose for the story is. And as a result, they'll give you developmental suggestions that are just plain wrong, because that's not what you're looking for. All right. Now, here are some of the most common types of journalism. News journalism. This is the type of journalism where most people think of when they hear the word journalism. These are the people who report on politics, crime, and other harder news stories. So these are probably the people who are showing up and writing a whole article about, like, there was a 6-person crash and 1 person tragically died, that kind of stuff. Or they arrested 6 gangbangers today, or whatever. Feature journalism. These feature stories are more in-depth news stories. These are meant to humanize people and talk about big events. So these are more kind of the ones about wars. These are kind of the ones about big changes in culture and society. these are ones that are going to be a lot more lengthy and take a lot more time and study and research. Then you have opinion-based journalism. Considering the fact that we were just talking about being non-biased, it's shocking, but it exists. There are opinion-based journalism techniques where these opinion pieces are articles that often express an author or journal company's viewpoint on an issue. Typically, these are what you see with politics when they're not like, I'm discovering corruption in politics. They're just like, vote for so-and-so because list. And so the opinion journalism can get a little murky, but honestly, if you feel like you have a very strong opinion about things, that might be for you. And last one, investigative journalism. Investigative journalists are supposed to shed light on important issues by conducting in-depth research. These stories tend to expose more corruption and wrongdoing. These ones are where you really need your people skills for investigative journalism because you really need to talk to those people, get those secret files, get those secret information. Make sure you talk to this random person, and if they let something slip, you're like, I'm putting that in. And so those are the ones where you'll need a little bit more people skills. You technically need it for all of them, but the investigative journalists definitely really need to do that. All right, last two things we're going to talk about. Now, when it comes to novels, sentence length, you always want to have variance. If you have 6 words in every sentence, you're going to look really strange unless that's a quirk of your character and you're just like, I like to write all sentences with 6 words in it. And they like purposely do that. Then okay, I guess you can do that. But typically sentence length is incredibly important. If you have only short sentences or only long sentences, that's going to feel weird. However, there's a catch. With news articles, because people's attention span is so small, smaller sentences actually are better. As a result, you want to have a range of smaller sentences, like super punchy and short to like slightly longer, but you probably don't want to do any compound sentences because the more compound and complex it gets, the more you'll lose the reader's attention. So you got to be quick, fast, snappy sentences. Keep them as crisp and clean and just have that nice crunch to them as possible. And when I say nice crunch, I just mean like if the consistency of your sentences should be like a good potato chip. They're not super thick and long. You want them to be short and crispy and thin. You gotta get straight to the point. All right, and the last thing that they mentioned in all my journalism research was quotes. Use as many quotes as you darn well please. They were like, use them liberally. Use them like butter on toast. You just, the more the better. Especially because of the fact that with quotations, it makes it so that people take you more seriously. If you're just saying, so-and-so said this, then it's far less intense. Whereas if you say, the direct quote is, and then you give the direct quote, that makes people take you more seriously. And it makes it so that if you have a word count deadline, like your boss says, gotta be 900 words, then you're like, great, I used 5 quotes and that's already 500. Now I just have to do 400 words of filler to make the quotes make sense. That makes it a lot easier for flow of writing in journalism. And like I said, it adds to your sincerity and adds to believability. All right. Any questions about journalism and creative writing with journalism? Not necessarily? Yeah.
I have a question about like what if you wanted to do journalism and you wanted to stay like anonymous, and so but you were like writing for a smaller community, and so they might like figure out it was you. So how could you like stay anonymous in the journalism field?
Nowadays it's a lot easier because of the fact that you could submit to, for example, New York and live in Utah and no one would know. As long as you don't tell them that. I think the only issue is you probably couldn't remain completely anonymous just because they'd have to have some way to pay you, and they'd need a name with a bank account to pay you. So I don't think there's any way to remain 100% anonymous. However, you could probably remain 80% anonymous and say like, hey, I want to publish under a pseudonym or something like that. And I bet you most publishing companies are totally fine with you publishing under a pseudonym. So the company would know you, and they would know your name, and they would know that you were the writer and everything. But you could tell them, like, I want to publish under Sky Walters or something, and then remain anonymous using that. I don't necessarily know if you can remain 100% anonymous, because then, like I said, there's no way to pay you. Unless you don't want to get paid, in which case, then, yeah, you can remain 100% anonymous. But most people want to get paid. Did that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions about journalism or anything like that? No? Okay. Well, to reiterate, like I've said every week for the last little while, but I will make sure that, just like to make sure that it's on the YouTube video and that other people hear, we still have the contest going on until the end of May. You now officially have a little over 2 months to finish the short story contest. Reminder, it is only 3,000 words now instead of 6,000 words for the limit, because unfortunately, well, fortunately, we got a ton of entries. Yay! But unfortunately, that means that for all of you who write 6,000 word stories, we just don't have the time to grade them. So we cut it down to 3,000. Hopefully that will work out. We might raise it back up, depending on if people find that is too strict or too much of a cut. But we'll see. We're going to see how it goes. I would say turn it in whenever you would like to, but I will say that take as much time as you need as well. The more polished your story is, the better it will do. So turning it in, 3 months early is great, but make sure that it's fully polished when you do so. Take that time. Because honestly, the most polished stories are typically the ones that do the best. Let's see, anything else important? I don't think so. We don't have a lot of stuff going on exciting this month for writing, but hopefully we will in the next few months, though. I'm going to turn off the video now, and then we can... Oh, first, I wanted to mention, next week we're going to be talking about apocalyptic worlds. A, how to do them realistically, but B, even if you're not doing realism and you're doing like a fantasy post-apocalyptic world, how to build the world in a way that feels realistic, even if it's not realistic. So we will be talking about that next week. Yeah, we're not closed next week. Good. Sorry. One of the Mondays we are closed, so I was like, wait, when is that? But I don't think it's next week. So that should be next week, and I'm going to turn off the video. Please remember, you can always recommend things, whether it's via comments or talking to me, for lessons that you would like to see.